Two comments to start. First, I think my paper is the negative and privative counterpoint to Philip's paper, which gives you a rich delineation of a Christian apocalyptic. This gives you sort of something else, something to think about, something to accept or reject. Secondly, dealing with Heidegger, I suppose, supposes that Christian thinking is in, and always is in, either the business of renovation or at least the business of refreshing, part of which is the openness to strangeness and to dialogue with it, which gets to the issue of what to do with Heidegger, or with a different intonation, what to do with Heidegger. Should we talk to him? We have. Should we? What are the limits of our dialogue? With that, I begin the paper. Philosophers of religion, systematic theologians, and readers of continental philosophy are all familiar with a Heidegger who makes metaphysics impossible, and to the extent to which Christian thought colludes with the history of metaphysics, of course it does, defined as ontotheology, that is, the reification of being, and or as a form of productionist metaphysics given over to efficient causality. It too, that is, Christian thought, is impossible. Christian philosophy, as Heidegger famously puts it in Introduction to Metaphysics, is an oxymoron, a square peg in a round hole. Arguably less familiar, however, is how Heidegger's philosophy crosses two major moments or movements, the first illustrated in the ontological phenomenology of being and time and the texts that prepare for it, the second illustrated by Heidegger's ruminations on ereignis or event in his elucidations of the points of Hölderlin and in his posthumously published so-called second masterpiece, Die Beitrage, seems to foreclose the possibility of tradition that is vital to many forms of Christianity, most certainly to Catholicism and to Eastern Orthodoxy, even if there is a friendly and family squabble between these groups regarding the content and extent of the tradition and how to understand it. This is a different kind of foreclosure, one that is more formal than material in kind, and depends in both textual phases on thinking about thinking as responsive to apocalyptic rupture that by definition cannot be recuperated in time. Whether death in being in time, the hour in Heidegger's reading of the apocalyptic Paul, whether the ruminations of a Hölderlin who waits on the possibility or the possible salvific hallowing coming constitutively deferred, or the hollowed out self, the concave self, patient of ereignis as the always untimely event that cleaves time. We're dealing in the case of Heidegger with the inimitable as well as the incalculable, the unshareable as well as the untimely. To the extent to which this apocalyptic rift is an indelible feature of Heidegger's thought, or otherwise expressed to the extent to which the absolute future cuts time, that is, subverts anticipation and recollection, then it puts a Christian philosophy, and by extension, Christian theology, in a bind. To contend that genuine thought can be handed on, traditio, is, on Heidegger's view, to pretend to accomplish what cannot be accomplished. That is, making the untimely timely, of channeling and routinizing event. Across Heidegger's Urden, across the so-called Kehre, Christian philosophy and theology could not have a future. To that extent, it also has no genuine past either. That is, it is not past as originary. It is always and never begun. To the extent to which Christian thought drapes itself in the appearance even of pastness, it is more or less spectral. The question addressed in this essay is what approach to Heidegger is possible for Christian and more particularly Catholic philosophers and philosophical theologians, who on Heideggerian grounds are oxymoronic and anachronistic. More particularly, what forms of assimilation of his apocalyptic thinking, if anything, is possible, given the commitment to tradition that seems to be an ineluctable feature of Christian thought. To focus the essay, I would like to return to Heidegger's debate with Cyril as something of a primal scene and use it as a hinge regarding the systemic nature of Heidegger's Apocalyptic. Davos, 1929, is not simply a journalistic moment of thinkers speaking past each other, though there's an exemplary moment of people not talking to each other. But in the case of Heidegger, a sign of refusal, not only of a particular tradition of philosophy, but of tradition itself. If Heidegger's contribution can be cast as the insistence and exposition of an apocalyptic style philosophy, it can also be thought of as the point of concentration between two distinct economies of Heidegger's apocalyptic thinking, either side of 1929, and thereby serve as a launching pad for a more detailed examination of why two different forms of apocalyptic philosophical ventures serve as a prophylactic against repetition, I assume is constitutive of tradition, whether we regard that repetition as non-identical and looser, or whether we regard it as identical and obviously not quite so loose. In the case of the first apocalyptic economy, I will attend not only to Being in Time, though also very briefly, but also to Heidegger's lectures on Paul and his critique of Dilthey's historiography, as setting the stage for the non-conversation with Cyril, who to all intents and purposes seems to represent a stand-in for Dilthey. In the case of the second apocalyptic economy, I will touch upon, but not develop, Heidegger's evocations of Ereignis and the Beiträge, the now and the fire of Hololinian interpretive construction, in which Heidegger seems to wash the great German poet clean of any elective affinity with Christian forms of thought. And in addition, I will supplement my commentary on Heidegger's constructive apocalyptic proposal by speaking to Heidegger's recurring broadsides in the Black Notebooks against the dominant forms of historiography, with its interest in the preservation of culture and or its rehabilitation after World War I, which it turns out he associates with Catholicism and which he further specifies, just in case we did not fully grasp his anti-Catholic prejudice as essential to the Jesuit mission. There are only Dominicans here today, so everything is okay. Not true, obviously not true. There we are, there we are. Of course, I knew that was not true, and I knew that you put up your hand. I was being devious, and clearly it worked. In the final section of this essay, we will turn and sum up the difficulties faced by any Christian philosophy, and more particularly any Catholic philosophy, in taking Heidegger's apocalyptic thinking on board, even if his anti-metaphysical bias has been corrected, or at least alleviated. And one could successfully make the argument that Christian or Catholic thought has not univocally succumbed to ontotheology. Whether the exception is negative theology, Jean-Luc Marion, the correct understanding of Thomistic essay, Fabreau, Ulrich, or whether as a practical matter, or even as a matter of principle, Catholic thought can be refined and supported in and through an encounter with phenomenology that bypasses the blockages to destruction and reconstruction that Heidegger introduces. The examples here would be Stein, Chivara, Rahner, and Balthasar, obviously in different ways and in different inflections. In the final section, we will reflect briefly on the question whether, on the basis of the elective affinity between Gadamer's hermeneutics and Christian and especially Catholic views of tradition, Catholic thinkers have been encouraged to think that Heidegger's thought represents a program for a renovated, dynamic form of tradition over against the view of tradition as either repeating certain formulae or reliving what might be called originary experiences. Yet if we take the apocalyptic thrust and curve of Heidegger's thought seriously and pay attention to his historiographical sophistications throughout his career, it is not clear that Gadamer can function as a bridge relative to any form of thought that supposes repetition and cultural formation. Heidegger always represents the outside, the barbarian, the one who destroys in the name of the nameless event that gives itself to thought and refuses repetition and sharing. And begin with Davos. A number of scholars have drawn attention to the philosophical event at Davos in 1929 as something of a primal scene in which the encounter between Heidegger and Cyril, the very fate of philosophy, was thought to hang in the balance. While undoubtedly expectations were far too high regarding outcome and fundamental decision, nonetheless the situation was a genuine hyperbole, in that Cyril and Heidegger represented with extraordinary clarity two fundamental options regarding whether, how, and to what extent philosophy is more than the owl of Minerva dealing in dusk with its past, but is or can be truly eventful in being grasped by that which comes from the future and thus is fundamentally interruptive and disruptive, or in other words, fundamentally revolutionary. What made debate potentially fruitful was that the designated area for the battle concerned the interpretation of Kant, with respect to whom both had already in play influential interpretations. By the time of the debate, Cyril had proven to be a developer as well as follower of Kant's theory of knowledge, and in particular had availed of a Kantian epistemology modified by German idealism to construct a philosophy of culture. In contrast, Heidegger, the celebrated author of Being and Time, had put into circulation a radical ontological Kant, discontinuous, here's the irony, with the epistemological regime of modern philosophy, and not obviously hospitable to a philosophy of culture that required not only the sense of regimes of representation and knowing, but also an affirmative sense of the Western tradition that guaranteed a significant measure of continuity in human thinking across history, even if, or especially if, this continuity by no means excluded discontinuity. That encounter was a debacle, a catastrophe in the etymological sense of the overturning of expectations, hardly needs to be stated. There was no resolution. In fact, there was no dialogue. As much farce as tragedy, and perhaps sometimes they go together, dialogue was subverted, not because the two protagonists actually tried to talk to each other, but simply failed. It was simply that a dialogue could not occur. Cyril's philosophy was intrinsically dialogical and had the capacity to critically engage other philosophies, and other cultural discourses, albeit running the danger of colonizing them and not leaving their strangeness speak long and loud enough. Heidegger's philosophy enjoyed no such capacity. It was the discourse of the other who had gone down, of the apocalypticist who speaks to the break that cannot be recuperated. When Heidegger talks positively about a canonical philosophical figure such as Kant, the figure is inevitably defamiliarized, indeed becomes the pretext for an invention that leaves him unrecognizable. If Cyril had constructed a philosophy as a civil discourse, indeed the discourse of civilization, at once its expression and its instrument, Heidegger, in fact, performs his self-assigned role as a barbarian, the one who speaks darkly, enigmatically, who splutters and cannot be understood, who may or may not be invited into the city of the polis, that is, in any event, according to him and according to Nietzsche before him, spent, that is, has used up all its resources and may, with justification, be sacked. At Davos, Heidegger's strong reading of Kant is in line with the radical eschatological tendency of being and time. Perhaps even more, it might be regarded as the inflection point between two acts of apocalyptic production, the first receiving its high point in the existential ontological phenomenology of Heidegger's masterwork, the second dominated by the event and no longer speaking the language of being, but the language of holy, and to the extent to which the language of being sort of still hangs around, rattling the standard language of being by making it archaic, by spelling it so S-E-Y-N, not S-E-I-N. All of this in the attempt to forestall thinking being trapped in the accepted categories of the West. Dasein is less a human subjectivity than an emptied site cleared for the deliverance of a mission for which it is to be the Vatic herald. A little bit more about the pre-Davos Heidegger and Apocalyptic. Beginning with the early phase of Heidegger's apocalyptic production, we can make a few points. First, Being and Time represents a double break, a break within and from phenomenology, which itself has already broken from the philosophical tradition governed by objectivism. In Being and Time, Heidegger effectively undoes Husserl's would-be philosophical revolution by breaking with phenomenology's developing subjectivist and idealist orientation. As is well known, conceptual formation in Being and Time is laid aside by Heidegger. Reality is more nearly opened up by mood. While resistant to conceptual formation, nonetheless, reality discloses itself in anxiety and the grasp that Dasein is not so much a subjectivity as a tremulous point of viewing its own facticity and fallenness, and even more, its grasp of the impossibility of its own death that can never be made part of its biography. Death is the future that does not belong to the retention-protension structure of time. It is the gift that you and I cannot refuse, yet that is not beholden to our wants. In any case, the love affair with Thanatos represents a commitment to the future as unequivocally unaccountable, or univocally unaccountable. Catholic readers of Heidegger's magisterial texts, such as Chavara and Stein, will expressly criticize Heidegger for what they deem as a nihilistic substitution of an appeal to God, who, if incalculable, represents the ground of our being and is characterized as absolute solicitude. Ronach presents another kind of Catholic response that is patently less critical than those of Chavara, Stein, and afterwards Hans Urs von Balthasar. Ronach does not so much reject Heidegger in this respect as ignore him. That towards which human being is always and ever oriented towards is God. It's prohibited, but he says it in any event. Rahner does not accept Heidegger's radicality, but uses Heidegger to redeem the claims first of Christian philosophy and subsequently Christian theology. He moderates the revolutionary charge. He ameliorates and mensurates its apocalyptic charge to enable it to dialogue with Christianity. Arguably, he does so with much greater complacency than either Shivara or Stein. Stein, after all, thought Husserl's revolution sufficient, and that in dialogue with Aquinas, Husserl could be saved from his idealist tendencies, while allowing a less poisoned environment for dialogue with Christianity than provided by Heidegger. She worried, as Shivara did, that Heidegger's atheism was not only methodological, as he claimed, but substantive in kind. Both of these Catholic figures not only talked against a Heidegger who subverted thought and ravaged the tradition, but I suppose each in his or her own way existentially performed the refusal of Heidegger. Stein by walking into the gas chamber at Auschwitz, Shivara by traversing the dark night of his own incapacities in a movement of acceptance before a God who gives himself in the manner of St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila gives himself in darkness and dereliction. Yet Being in Time is a summation of a groping towards the elaboration of an eschatological ontology that is general rather than regional. Heidegger's Lectures on Paul in 1921 represents an attempt to extract such an eschatology from the writings of Paul, especially Thessalonians and Galatians. Featured is the hour, the moment of decision, expectation, and waiting. Not, it seems, for the return of Christ, but for a je ne sais quoi. Christ's coming is whited out, thereby guaranteeing the coming no longer has determinate features, either pure coming, pure future, pure interruption, or coming whose determinate form is only given at arrival. There is no language in place for this coming, for this unanticipatable future or futuring. The only appropriate language would be the strange language from the future. At best, biblical language provides notice of what philosophy has to achieve. Philosophy would have to speak a language that thus far it has not shown itself capable of speaking. Thus a detour through Scripture. And if philosophy were ever to speak such an alien language, it would prove difficult, if not impossible, to decipher. It would seem to be noise, garbled at best, without a grammar, or at least without a grammar that we would recognize. Of course, the brazenness of Being in Time is precisely such a massive alteration of philosophical grammar, a language from the future as the language of and about the future. If Heidegger's Lectures on Paul provide a clue to the radical eschatology of Being in Time that sets limits to the possibility of dialogue at Davos, Heidegger's reading of Dilthey's historiography in his 1925 essay prepares us for what will be, in effect, Heidegger's construction of Cyril. Dilthey is a historian of culture and worldviews who comments on changes and assumptions across history, but essentially leaves the fabric of the Western intellectual tradition intact. Truth may be temporalized. Its warrants become less assured. But it is still in play, since thought continues to have the capacity to master time, to periodize, and to name. Dilthey is engaged in Being in Time as a form of culture philosophy that cannot be allowed to stand. It is not only the case that Dilthey's thought is not as fundamental as that of Aristotle account. In fact, his far more temporal and historical form of philosophy essentially betrays time. Within the Heideggerian ambit, Dilthey's philosophy is a form of soft porn. It titillates, suggests that philosophy has been refurbished and brought up to date, while all the time keeping the would-be cultural knower safe from a more primordial counter and a going down into the danger of time and its breaking down of individuals and groups. At Davos, Cyril is assimilated to Dilthey, post-Davos. In his works after Davos, Heidegger does not relent of the revolutionary, eschatological, and/or apocalyptic turn. If he modifies its form in significant respects, he does not change the essentials. The mode of access to phenomena, however, will look different. As intimated in Being and Time, the different mode of access will include the switch from the focus on Dasein to Sein, and the accomplishment of the hermeneutic of the philosophical tradition in which Heidegger will excavate precisely what the great philosophers such as Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, and Schelling did not say, or rather better, had repressed. If these consummate Western philosophical insiders are capable of being rescued, it is only as outsiders, as aliens, foreign to themselves, who now will be speaking in alien tongue. That is, Kant will not be Kant, Schelling will not be Schelling, etc. Or in short, these figures of Western civilization can themselves only be rescued as barbarians. Heidegger does not relent with making particular philosophers more or less unrecognizable. In addition, he wants to further make strange the philosophical environment of thinking by appeals to forms of thought that do not operate under its standard protocols. Whether the thought of the pre-Socratics, whose oracular statements he makes the measure of the Western philosophical tradition, Christian concepts of grace and mission, of emptying and waiting, and the thought of the dictator, especially Hölderlin, who show the capacity to speak and think otherwise, not merely at a slant to the Western tradition, but perpendicular to it. Throughout, however, the apocalyptic regime, constitutive of Heidegger's thought, continues even if a new key, in which Sein, spelled with a Y, signals a language older than the language of being, and older than the language of the holy of ancient Greece that Hölderlin resurrects, or at least brings to life. The fourfold at once recapitulates mythic hierogamy, earth and sky, male and female, and submits it to a demythologizing translation whose purpose is solely to rule out the division of reality into an upper and lower, an invisible and invisible, a purely divine dimension and a human dimension. Heidegger refuses the fetishization of transcendence into that transcendent, and thus the invention of metaphysics, and correlatively, the embalming of the Christian God. The key to the refiguration of apocalyptic is the cipher of event, Ereignis, with its associated postures on the side of Dasein, of openness, divestiture, waiting, and courage in the face of the incalculable. To the degree to which the event can be brought to language, we're dealing with a Sprachereignis, a language event. And there are two crucial sites for such: Heidegger's elaboration of the poetic thinking of Hölderlin and Heidegger's posthumously published by Träger. Of course, throughout, Heidegger constructs himself as a prophet and seer, speaking a strange language. This is apparent in and through Heidegger's analysis of the holy, and in and through his strong reading of Hölderlin that lifts the German poet out of his contemporary context of romantic aspiration and idealist construction. Hölderlin is a thinker of the hour, the decisive moment of exposure in which self relent of all that they have known and pledge to a reality that is arrival itself, and which remains ineluctably enigmatic in that it withholds a full showing and holds in reserve its evidence. If the poet is a figure of spirit, he or she is also a figure of fire, of being set on fire by time, in time, and has ceded to the play of chance. Heidegger is in effect making Hölderlin a stranger to Western history, constructing himself as an alien too, or at least an internal emigre, and radicalizing the untimely nature of his thought. And with respect to Hölderlin, Heidegger also performs an operation of erasure similar to that evident in his treatment of both Augustine and Kierkegaard in Being and Time and St. Paul earlier on. There is a conspicuous absence of mention of Christ in his interpretation of Hölderlin's poems, and a refusal to think that the eschatological thrust in Hölderlin is linked in any way to Christianity. In any event, strictly speaking, Ariadnes has no history, no tradition. It stands for what is alone worth saying, and yet is impossible to say, while suggesting that all the Western traditions of discourse are worthless, illusions constructed for our comfort, forms of blindness, optimal for our needed sense of control. Heidegger will continue to return to origins that come from a future that civilized persons and believers cannot inhabit. The repetitions of the primal event, in the case of the exceptions, are not intended to give us knowledge. They are intended to remind us of how lost we are. After Davos, in his interpretation of philosophers as well as poets, Heidegger will counter their standard profiles with his own. It would be a mistake, however, to think that the challenge is episodic rather than systemic, as if what is at stake in each case is a new reading by Heidegger, intended to displace the older, more established reading, a kind of form of genius of intervention. Heidegger, in fact, attacks the historiographical regime that makes conventional readings of individual thinkers possible. Though Heidegger intimates his broader species of attack throughout his reading of particular thinkers. Arguably, the place where he is most clear about the distance between his historiography that deals with the sending of being and conventional historiography is the Black Notebooks. If the notebooks, now infamous, do not tell us much by way of philosophical substance that we didn't know already from books published in Heidegger's lifetime, they confirm some of the prejudice for which he has become famous. For example, the connection between Jewry and a deracinated modernity, and his prejudice against Catholicism that effectively reaches the level of obsession. Nevertheless, on any reading of the Black Notebooks, the obsession of obsessions is with a common historiography, historie, and what in translation is referred to as historiology. Historiology, standard history, which kind of gives you continuity so there's no over time, and also provides you with culture. Standard history or historiology is decadence, the doxography that blocks the appearance of event, which is the novum that explodes what has already been taken for granted. Historiology forestalls the true history, which, if it can be written of at all, is strange beyond riddle. The Black Notebooks, however, do tell us something about the fiasco of Davos as a conversation that did not take place because it could not take place. Relative to conventional philosophical discourse and Christian discourse, Heidegger's newly minted philosophical discourse was Babel, and effectively Babel-inducing when brought into conversation with Western philosophical and theological languages. And come to my conclusion. Across the two movements of his apocalyptic thought, with his inflection point in Davos, Heidegger both showed and said not only that he could not abide the philosophical tradition, but arguably any discourse that was customary, which in his view was the very nature of discourse as fallen. Thus the difficulty of being in time, with its noun compounds, its neologisms, and its new existential ontological grammar. Thus also the discourse of Ariadnes, of its enigma, its unrecognizability, and how to be authentically responsive to it. And thus the making strange of Hölderlin as a poetic thinker who intimates coming and suggests its noiselessness and forever mysterious quality. So what then, in the case of Christian thought, or even more particularly Catholic thought? What then are the intrinsic prospects for dialogue with Heidegger? Of course, we're not denying that actual conversation was there from the beginning, and that Heidegger has, as a matter of fact, been embraced by Catholic thinkers in the continental tradition in whole or in part. Though prestige cannot be ruled out as an incentive, Heidegger's engagement with Christian thought, though unreservedly critical, served as an invitation to reform, or at least to imagine a tradition of discourse that was living rather than dead, not rote repetition, but non-identical repetition, possible if one was animated by contact with the founding source or sources of that very tradition. Of course, some Christian thinkers rejected Heidegger outright, not being persuaded by his critique of metaphysics or even feeling the need to engage. What proved attractive to some Christian thinkers, Catholic thinkers not excluded, is how in different moments in Heidegger's apocalyptic discourse, one could also find Christian traces. In being in time, Dasein's fallenness, angst, being towards death. In the case of Heidegger's post-Davos productions, his reflections on Gelassenheit, mystical Gelassenheit, mindfulness, his doxological view of the I moving towards the condition of prayer, of thank you, in which belonging is the other side of ecstasy. And what is there not to embrace in the way in which, in his own expropriated voice, or in the voice of his proxy Hölderlin, Heidegger speaks to us of the sacrality of the world in a time of ultimate technological profanation. We can indeed choose to put aside Heidegger's blatant hierarchies in which the elements of Christian discourse are used as indicators, at best, of a higher and deeper conceptuality and language. Obviously, painful questions follow. How can Christian thinkers be satisfied with so little? The ghost of Kierkegaard and doublets of mystical ecstasy, prayer, liturgy, and the saints in a new ideational world in which God is banished so that the gods, the occasions or personae of the holy, can abide. In the second as well as the first iteration of his discourse, Heidegger has indicated that he speaks a different language than the language of the philosophical tradition, and a different language than the Christian philosophical and theological traditions. It is a new language, the language of the new, that interrupts the functioning of normal or normalizing discourse, in effect deranging it and making impossible any and all notion of tradition. The apocalyptic tendency evident across both movements implies rupture, incommensurability, implies that Christians yield without term, just leaving open the one hope that the language of the alien, that is Heidegger's language, the language of the barbarian, will deign to colonize it. Last page. To read Heidegger across both the movements of his discourse is to get a strong sense of a non serviam that does not appear to be as violent as it actually is, only because Heidegger is so sure of the absolute gap between his discourse of the new, both of and from the future, and Western philosophical discourses and the theological discourses that he assumes are almost inevitably hostage to it. Yet despite what Heidegger shows and says, surely, we say, a bridge can be provided. There is always a bridge, we say. Perhaps the bridge to dialogue with the Western tradition and Christianity can be supplied by a hermeneutic discourse that is in fact created out of the elements of Heidegger's discourse. What if? What if, as Gadamer proposes, one puts together Heidegger's reflections in being and time on understanding and interpretation with his later reflections on the linguisticality of being and event to fashion a hermeneutic theory that would justify a tradition, even if it also encouraged throwing over much of it and always being mindful of how that tradition needs to be refreshed. Maybe this is the bridge. A connection is made, a peace treaty signed between event and its relative establishment, disestablishment. While this hermeneutic view won't favor the idea of tradition as the safe handing on, that is tradition in a strict sense, it will allow a measure of continuity in all the discontinuity, though continuity will necessarily have to be hard-earned. It's easy to see why Christian thinkers, especially those who tend to operate in terms of both and, would find this option attractive. The question is whether such a bridge can be built. Much depends on the assessment of the gap between Heidegger's apocalyptic discourse and the discourses of the philosophical and theological traditions. Does the bridge span a river or an ocean? Davos seems to tell us that it is an ocean, and intellectual honesty would force us to hear that Heidegger's refusal to dialogue and is showing why it is impossible. He tells us that thinking the future and thinking from the future is not something either the Western philosophical and theological traditions either have done or can do. The philosophical and theological traditions belong to the past. Maybe not even that, but perhaps it might be best described as toxic scum on the surface of an infinitely mobile reality that gives and withdraws. And the only response that Heidegger leaves the Christian thinker is to imagine an absolute future that is not Heraclitean, but to turn to the generous, ecstatic God who has, we believe, loved us into existence, continues to abide with us, invites response in word, act, and life, shows us the way, and precisely because we are touched by the future that solicits and consoles, also provides us with a past unavailable to us without his coming. Thank you.